The last session of the day, infrastructure management. I think we'll get started and people can come in if they want. I think we saved the best for last, and that is how do we, with System Center 2012, help in the management of your infrastructure, the physical components for making up the private cloud. So we're going to talk about a couple of things today. We're going to talk about how you can use Virtual Machine Manager to do your underlying private cloud infrastructure component management, as well as once you've created a private cloud, how to manage that piece of it. And then from there, we'll move into Operations Manager for monitoring the underlying environment and VMM for maintaining your private cloud. So we got basically like 4 hours worth of content that we're going to try and get into 45 minutes. So I'm going to try and breeze over the slides and go straight into the demos so that you can see this stuff in action. I think that might help explain the things that we're talking about. But I really want to focus on this next slide here. And this slide is, how do we see building of the private cloud? So you have all of this different physical pieces of infrastructure. You may have Dell, HP, IBM computers. You may have Intel and AMD processors. You may have Hyper-V VMware installed. You may have different types of networking and SAN environments. Maybe you have some iSCSI NetApp devices and some EMC fiber channel connected SAN. How do I bring all of that diverse infrastructure together and through abstraction assign these physical resources, either dedicating them to people or sharing them across my different cloud resources to create this logical and standardized infrastructure? Now, once I have this logical and standardized infrastructure, I can abstract that and create these things called a cloud. So with this cloud abstraction, I can take some of these resources and assign them to my dev environment. I can take other sets of these resources and assign it to my production environment. And by putting those things together, I've delegated these pools of resources that now I can start delegating access to. So within VMM, I'll delegate via user roles access to each of these cloud resources. And a user can be a member of one or multiple user roles and can have access to one or more clouds. But those user roles can define limits as to how much of the resources I have. Now, once I've delegated this capacity, I can now start deploying those templates that we talked about earlier in the application session, where I can have these standardized deployments of these templates that are deployed when I need these services. And I can take that same service and deploy it in multiple clouds as needed. That's the basis for a lot of the conversation we're going to have today, is how do we construct this private cloud, and then once it's constructed, how do we keep it up and running? So there are two pieces that we look at when we're managing when we're thinking about System Center 2012. The first is configure and deploy. How do I take these resources and configure or deploy OSs to them, whether they're compute or manage the storage resources or the networking resources, and then pull it all together to create a cluster? So how do I get those components ready to become that private cloud infrastructure? And then second, once I've pulled all those things together, how do I abstract those resources to create these pools of clouds that I can assign access to? How do I handle those multiple different types of hypervisors that I may have in my environment? Because from what I've heard and what I've seen from our customers, they're not a one hypervisor shop anymore, just like they're not a one server shop anymore. They have multiple different hypervisors that satisfy different needs. Once I've managed these environments and created these clouds, how do I provide that access with the control that I need? So the next bunch of slides are going to talk about those 8 sections we just spoke about. And I'm going to go through a couple of things, and then I'll flip over to the demo, and we'll just skip ahead. I think these decks are going to be made available, so you'll be able to go back and read the marketing type terms and the detail on the slides, but I think seeing what we're talking about makes these things a lot easier to understand. So in the first demo this morning, we showed bare metal deployment of a server. What that actually does is a complex step of processes, and it automates for you. First of all, you choose the server that you want to deploy, and then after you hit go, while you're drinking coffee, what's happening under the covers is that, first of all, the VMM server is going to connect to that out-of-band management card and tell that server to reboot. And it's going to reboot using Pixie, and when it boots from Pixie, it's going to hit a WDS server. And that WDS server is going to authenticate that SM BIOS from that machine with the VMM server. The VMM server is going to say, yep, that's the right one. Here's the WinPE image. Download that to the machine. Boot up the machine. At that point, it's going to run some general command execution scripts. And those are going to do the following. They're going to format any hard drives that you set up. They're going to create the environment and get it ready to then retrieve the virtual hard disk, which is going to be the boot from VHD that this machine is going to use. So at that point, after it goes through those general commands, it's going to now connect to the VMM library server and download the VHD. So this is great because now I can have a centralized repository for my VHDs for my VMs and the ones for my underlying Hyper-V hosts. I'll download that VHD file down to the machine. I'll download any drivers and inject those drivers into the VHD. So if I have specialized NIC card or a QLogic Fiber Channel SAN card or something like that that I need a special driver for, I can set that up so that when I deploy the virtual machine, it will inject that driver into the VHD. And at that point, I'll now reset the machine. So I'll reboot the VM, the physical machine. I'll connect to the domain server. I'll join the domain, enable the Hyper-V role, reboot the machine again. And at that point now, it's a machine that can be managed by VMM. It gets added to a host group, and now all I can do is take a couple more steps, configure it, and then add it to a cluster. So it does all of that work for me and makes sure that I have this repeatable process. Now there's Config Manager that also does things like bare metal deployment. And we think that for your physical machines, or the machines that need, for your physical machines that you have in your environment, use Config Manager to do that task sequencing, that deployment. But for your Hyper-V systems, use the bare metal deployment within VMM, basically treating those Hyper-V servers as appliances that I can then deploy my OS to. Also using VMM for things like checking the baselines and doing the patch updates, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. All right, so I've added that machine. The other thing we talked about in that demo is we showed how to manage the storage more effectively. Your storage admins can now give you a pool of storage resources, and you can use that resources to manage your virtual machines the best way you can. So we provide things like end-to-end mapping. So I know that this VHD is on this LUN, which is on this physical server, which is connected to this HBA, connected to this port on the Fiber Channel SAN. It can help with capacity management. As I start running out of resources, I can deploy new LUNs as I need to. It can also help me with rapid provisioning. In, say, a VDI environment where I want to deploy thousands of virtual machines, I can do that by using the SMIS protocol to make copies of the LUNs or replicate the LUNs and deploy virtual machines out from there. So how that works, we basically have 4 different steps here too. The first one is, through our SMIS provider, we'll discover the different SAN devices that are out there. We'll take those SAN devices and we'll create classifications. And these classifications allow me to say, this expensive storage, I only want to have certain VMs on, or I only want certain people to use. So I'm going to classify it as, say, expensive storage. This other storage, not so expensive, anybody can use it, or any VM can use it. And I can create these different storage classifications, assign them to a host group, and once they're assigned to a host group, I can now start delegating some of those existing LUNs and assign them to existing hosts or clusters, or I can create a brand new LUN, and I can take that LUN and assign it to an existing host or cluster. We'll handle the things like the masking and the unmasking of that LUN so that only the servers that need access to that storage will be able to access that storage. And then lastly, we talked about network management. And in network management, we can create this logical abstraction of that complex networking for this virtual machine environment. So we do that by allowing you to create different things like address pools for your IP addresses. So my VMs can boot up without DHCP. I can use statically assigned addresses that just get pulled from a pool. We also help manage load balancers. And where this helps me is in the following. If I have a virtualized environment, I can take my simple and my complex networking and create these similar logical networks, whether they're on my dev environment or my production environment. So when I've created these virtual machines and these services that I've deployed, I can take, say, in my dev environment, and when I say use logical network DMZ and logical network prod, it will appropriately assign it to the correct networks that those physical hosts are attached to. And if I do that in my production environment, I can have multiple services using those same logical networks, whether they're in the same data center or in a separate data center. So by abstracting that network, it makes it easier to create that attachment because my deployed VMs will get assigned the correct IP address depending on the host that they're being pushed towards. And then after I set up all the underlying infrastructure, I can bring it all together by creating a cluster. I can use VMM itself to do the initial cluster creation. In other words, just go create new cluster, add the host I want to add to that cluster. It'll handle the masking of the LUNs and the networking. Once I finish that, if I want to add a new one, I can just drag and drop it in. So let's show you what some of that looks like. So here in this VMM environment, I have multiple sets of clusters. I have a Hyper-V cluster here, I have an ESX cluster, and I actually have a Zen server cluster. And one of the things to notice here is that they're all in the same host group. So I can manage them the same even though they're separate in different types of hypervisors. I also have a standalone host, ConBM03. And all I need to do to add that to a cluster is just take the system and drag it up to cluster 1 and drop it, and it'll add the node into the cluster. I'll use my domain run as account. I'll skip cluster validation. And what you'll see is the following, is that first of all, there we go. First of all, the BM03 server isn't able to access the cluster shared LUNs right now, that cluster shared volume where I store my virtual machines. But through the process of adding the node to the cluster, what'll happen is we'll do that LUN masking. So if we look at add node to cluster, we provide things like create the cluster network, attach the logical units to that machine so that it can now access the same cluster storage, add the node to the storage, and do all that work for me. So I don't have to go to failover cluster manager to add a node to a cluster. I don't have to go to my storage environment and mask the LUN to the server. We'll do that stuff for you within VMM. And while that's coming up, I'll show you a couple other things. Within VMM itself, we can also manage our storage and our networking environments. So we have the networking which we showed you during the demo this morning. But under storage, I didn't show you a lot of the cool things that you can do with storage. So I can create these different classifications, like I have a high-speed SAN and a tier 2 storage. And as you can see under here, I have multiple different storage pools assigned to these different SAN environments. So if I have multiple SANs out there, say an EMC SAN and an HP SAN, I can create different storage pools on each of them, assign them to classifications. They can share the same classification or different classifications, and then attach those classifications to the host groups and the clouds to be used. And what I'll do here is I can do things like quickly add a LUN. So if we look here under assigned, I have a couple of LUNs here. I just have this HV01 data LUN. I can just create a brand new one, create logical unit. I'll pick the assigned storage pool, So it looks at the same one there. We'll call this MMS Istanbul. And we'll create a 250 gigabyte LUN. Once I hit OK here, it's going to, through the SMS provider, talk to the SAN storage, say, hey, provision me out a new LUN, assign it to this classification here, and now I'll be able to take that LUN and I could assign it to different hosts within my pool if I needed to. So if we give it a few seconds here, it'll come up. But while that's going and being created, what I can do is flip over here to the arrays, and we can see I'm connected to that Dell Compellent storage that we showed you inside the demo earlier today. And I have a certain amount of capacity that's available to me and a certain amount that I've used and multiple storage pools that I have access to. And if my SAN guy gives me another LUN or another pool that I have access to, I can just simply attach it here. So we can also create LUNs, we can also delete LUNs, but we'll only delete LUNs that we created. So if your SAN guy gave you a LUN, we're not going to delete that, but we can still do the masking and the unmasking operations from there. All right, so that's still working. We'll wait till it finishes. But while that's going, I'll flip back to the presentation. And we'll talk about now that I've built all this infrastructure together, we want to do things like create clouds. So through cloud abstraction, we can take this pool of physical resources and build the logical representations that we need for accessing things like production, development, pre-staging. Depending on your organization, you'll probably have between 3 and 5 clouds at the cloud level. And either they'll be described as like their task, like development, production, or they'll be assigned to, say, a group like HR or finance. And what we do is by creating this cloud abstraction, we do a lot of things. It allows us to create now the self-service capability so we can assign these different clouds to the different user roles and they can use their self-service websites that we showed you earlier today. We can view within these clouds all the different deployed services and what VMs are deployed within the cloud. And then we can also, because this cloud is really just a construct, you can over-provision. In other words, I could have 2 clouds that have 50 gigabytes of RAM assigned to each of them, attached to the same set of servers that may only have 30 gigs. So that means I'm actually overcommitted at 70 gigs. And we'll allow you to use all the resources on that cloud. But if you add more resources, we'll let you use up to the 50 that you have. The other thing is we can leverage those existing virtualization environments, whether it's Hyper-V, VMware vSphere, or Citrix Xen Server. You can manage them the same way within VMM so that VMs deployed are deployed in the same manner, whether it's to a Hyper-V system, a VMware system, or a Citrix system. So how we support multiple hypervisors is Virtual Machine Manager will connect your Hyper-V servers, your VMware vSphere environment through vCenter, or your Citrix Xen Server environment. And once they're managed by VMM, then if you need to deploy a service, you can simply deploy that service and create the VM that you have to be deployed on any of these environments. So that VM service that we talked about earlier if you were here at the application session, I have the underlying virtual hard disk and then I have the application stuff on top of it. Well, that same service I can deploy to a Hyper-V system, or by changing the underlying VHD underneath, I could deploy that same service to a Citrix server. So create a new service template pointing to the Xen server VHDs. Or I can take that system and I can deploy a mixed or a hybrid service where pieces of that service are deployed on Hyper-V and other pieces are deployed on, say, VMware. So I have the option or the ability to deploy that same type of service and use the hypervisor that best handles that environment. The other thing I can do is I can delegate who has access to these cloud resources. And I do that through the creation of user roles. And a user role allows me to set things like quota and actions upon that cloud. So I can specify whether that user can start, stop VMs, or they can create new VMs. Can they create any old VM and author one, or can they only deploy from template? So I have all these different options on what they can do, and do that via creating custom rules, via Active Directory. We can pull in who has access to these cloud resources. The other thing I can do is I can assign quota. And when I'm assigning quota, I'm looking at things like how much of the resources do I want the entire user role to access, and how much of those resources do I want one particular user to be able to access. So I can specify, say, at the all users combined level, 50 virtual machines could be deployed in this example here. Well, at the individual user level, I only want them to be able to deploy 10 virtual machines. That way, not any one user will monopolize the system, nor that entire group will monopolize the system. So what happens here is that the first user could deploy 10 VMs, the second 10, third, fourth, and fifth can all deploy 10. That sixth user that tries to deploy another virtual machine wouldn't be able to, because they've deployed 50 within the group, so the group would hold how many that virtual machine can deploy, how many virtual machines that group can deploy. And then lastly, we talked about this service template model, and that a service template has multiple tiers, or one or more tiers, and each of those tiers is made up of a VM template, which has things like the hardware profile, the OS, and the application profile. And then I can take that application and have a consistent way of deploying it across my multiple cloud environments. So let's show you some of the stuff that we talked about here. Inside of VMM, I have these hosts, and we look at the storage. Let's see, did it come up? Yep, see there's a 256 gig LUN was created. So now let's look at the hosts again. So one of the things that we talked about was I have different environments here. I have my Hyper-V environments, I have my ESX environments, and I have my Zen server. Well, I have some other ESX servers. So how do I add them into my pool of resources? I simply do that by doing an add resource, and instead of picking Hyper-V hosts, I'll pick the VMware ESX server hosts and clusters. I'll choose a domain or a root account on the ESX box so that I can log into it. And then, at this point, I'm already managing a vCenter server, and it's showing me all the different hosts in that vCenter server that I still don't have under management within Hyper-V, or within VMM. So I'll pick this cluster, this DRS cluster here, and I'll say next. And now I have a choice of where I want to put it. I could choose the same host group that my production ESX servers are in, or I could put it in, say, my pre-prod environment. And so I'll pick my pre-prod host group here, hit next, finish. And at this point here, it's going to take those ESX servers and add them in under the pre-prod environment. And as you see, they're here being added in a, what we call pending state. Once this finishes adding those ESX servers, the next thing I need to do is just connect into each one of them, capture their SSH key so that I can manage them, as well as connect them to whatever logical networks I want this environment to use. Once I've done all that, these servers are ready to be managed and ready to have VMs deployed on them through VMM. The other thing that I'll need to do is I'll need to manage the underlying virtual machine templates that maybe are out there in my existing VMware infrastructure. So inside the library, I have the ability to import VMware templates. So we're going to connect directly to the vCenter server. We're going to look at what existing templates it has there, allow you to choose the template you want to import, and then when you say OK, at this point, it's going to grab just the metadata of that template. So we're not going to import the entire template into VMM, because that would mean every time we had to deploy a new virtual machine, we'd have to copy across the network the VHD file or the VMDK file, which would take forever to copy that file. So instead, so sorry about that. So instead, what we do is we copy the just the information about the virtual machine from vCenter. And then when we need to deploy a new virtual machine, we will just use the vCenter API and connect to vCenter and say deploy new VM, and it'll go and do it for us through vCenter. Saves a lot of time when you're deploying virtual machines. After we pick the import, we see that the ESX Web Server VM template has been pulled up there and is available and ready to be used, to be deployed against. So I've talked to you now about the multi-hypervisor management, adding those templates and services. The other thing that I can do and want to do is be able to manage these clouds. So to create a brand new cloud, it's real simple. I just hit, whoops, wrong button. Escape out of that. Just hit create cloud, or right click on the clouds and hit create cloud. At this point, when I'm creating the cloud, it asks me a bunch of different questions. Which host do I want to use for this cloud? So I have the ability to use hosts for my dev or my production environment, the pre-prod environment. I'm going to pick production here. I can choose which network I want this cloud to be able to service, and I want to pick the Contoso network. I want to choose this load balancer. That's okay. Next. Pick the different virtual IP profiles. Usually we have a timer to see, can we get in under 20 seconds? Because I've assigned that high-speed classification of SAN to the host group that I chose, the production host group, I can determine whether or not I want to use that storage for this cloud as well. I'm going to say, yes, I want to use this storage. And then if I wanted to add special things like stored VM paths and those types of things, I can specify the limits. So we talked about specifying at the user role. I can also specify at the cloud role. I like to keep that as unlimited. And now I can choose which types of virtual machines can I create within this cloud. I want to be able to create Hyper-V VMs, Zen Server, as well as ESX. Because I have all those hypervisors in there, I might as well deploy virtual machines on any of those hypervisors. If I wanted to and say, okay, I have those VMware systems there, but I don't want to use them for this cloud, I can just uncheck that box, and they wouldn't be able to deploy VMware type of virtual machines. Hit next and finish. And at that point, it'll now create the cloud. Let me minimize this. And I have this MMS Istanbul cloud available. Obviously, nothing's in there yet because I haven't deployed a service to it. The next thing after I create this cloud is to create add a user role to be able to manage or deploy virtual machines into that cloud. I can do it one of two ways. I can create a brand new one or take an existing one and just add this as additional capacity for that existing user role. So we'll take this existing user role right here, this demo self-service user role. And what we can see is that we have specific members. So we have this cloud self-service user as a member, and he's the only person that can use this role. Under scope, we can choose which clouds they have access to. Once we pick the clouds, we have the ability to set quota. I can say, okay, you can only have 4 virtual machines at the user role level and at the user, and that's the entire group level. Any resources I can give him. He has access right now to the expense manager template. I can give him more access to different templates if I want. Under actions, this is where I can specify what they can do within that cloud. Maybe initially I want to give them full access, but I really don't want my self-service users to have the author ability. I would rather they only have the ability to deploy a VM or a service from a template I've given them access to. So I'll pick only deploy from template only. I want them to be able to pause their VMs, connect to them to see, the console of the VM, and then just start, stop, shut down, and let's see what else we got here. And the other one may be remove. I'll let them be able to delete their own VMs. So I can give them the different capabilities that I want to give them. I can add any particular run as accounts if I want, and then hit OK. And at this point, right. I should be able to see the different resources I have available to me and be able to access them. And if we look here under scope, it didn't save, obviously, so I'll add that in there and let's see what happens. Okay, I know what's going on. Whatever. So that's what I need to do to set up how I give access to this different cloud users from within VMM itself. So we talked about the configure and deploy side. How do we get this stuff up and running? How do we make it available to our different end users through creating this different cloud and resources and delegate access to those cloud resources? Now I got to keep it up and running. So how do I do that? Well, in the monitor and operate, you have the ability with System Center 2012 to be proactive. Take a look at the utilization and the resources and how things are performing in your environment and proactively make adjustments to fix things like, am I getting enough performance and those types of things. I want to have corrective capabilities where I can fix problems as they occur, identify where those problems are, and quickly address those problems. If I need to update the underlying virtualization hosts, the Hyper-V hosts in my private cloud, I want to be able to do it in a standardized approach that has no downtime to the applications running on those physical resources. And I want to ensure that those resources are available. Besides that, after I have this cloud and I'm finished monitoring the underlying infrastructure, I want to make sure that the virtual machines that are running on this cloud are optimized in that they're running on the best physical resources for the type of load that's on that cloud. In other words, I don't want all my VMs running on one box when I have a couple other servers that are just totally available for me. And how do I fix that piece of it? I want to be controlled in how I can set limits on who can access this cloud. Not only do I do it when I create the cloud, but I also need to control access over time when people are already accessing that cloud and I need more or less access for those users. I want to standardize my approach to updating those applications, and I want these clouds to be right-sized now as well as in the future. So I want to have insight into how I'm growing with these resources so I can increase my load or get servers in before I need them and run into performance bottlenecks. So here we got a couple of ways that we do that. With Operations Manager, we do the compute and the OS monitoring as well as the network monitoring. So Operations Manager now has it within it the ability to monitor your underlying network. And what Operations Manager gives you is knowledge about what's happening within your environment, either through company-provided management packs or your own internally developed management packs. You can put down the knowledge as far as if this happens, these are the things you need to do to fix it, whether it's something like within Microsoft where we say you got to turn on these services, or it's something in your company where it's like, every time this happens, I always have to go to the DNS and reboot that first before I can fix this. So, you can store all that inside of the alerts, so when things happen, you can fix them quickly. The other thing is we now have out-of-the-box network monitoring. And this allows me to discover the underlying network topology, whether it's all within one vendor or multiple vendors in my switching technology. This means that I can monitor this stuff for utilization, I can monitor it for uptime, and I can have a nice, rich reporting view of how my network environment looks. So I can see which switches are connected to what, which physical servers are connected to those switches, so that if I can't connect to a physical server, I can drill down and find out exactly why I can't get to that server. And then we have reporting capabilities as well. The other thing we talk about is the ability to update these servers. And through update management, we have the ability to create a baseline of my Hyper-V hosts within a cluster, and then as I need to provide updates, we update it in an orchestrated manner. So we'll connect to an update server, WSUS server, and at that point, we'll maintain a baseline. We'll check the different physical servers against that baseline, and if any of these servers is below the baseline, we'll do an orchestrated update where it'll update one host, it'll move all the virtual machines off of that host, update the host, reboot the host, bring it back into the cluster, take the second host then, and put that basically in maintenance mode, which will evacuate all the VMs off of that host, take that host, bring it out of the cluster, reboot it, update it, reboot it, put it back in the cluster, and do that across all the different hosts within my cluster. This way I have an orchestrated way of updating the cluster without bringing down any of the virtual machines running on top. And then lastly, we have the ability with System Center 2012 to really back up your environment and ensure that you can have the availability that you need by doing a couple of things. One, with Data Protection Manager, we can back up your different Microsoft environments, whether it be your Exchange, SQL, or SharePoint servers, whether it's just your straight Windows servers, anything that supports VSS, we can back up through Data Protection Manager. And when we back that up, you can back it up to a system and then back up that system to either another system at a different data center or maybe up into the cloud, or do things like online snapshots or tape backup. So you have a lot of flexibility in how you back up this environment so that when if something happens, you can restore it quickly and get back to operational. The other thing is we can build in things like automated recovery, where if something gets alerted via Operations Manager and we find that there's a problem, then Operations Manager can do one of two things. It could just automatically kick off a runbook through Orchestrator, or it could modify or notify Service Manager, create an incident there, and through that incident automatically kick off a runbook. But what this means is that I can quickly automate the resolution of a problem. So in this example, I have a SQL server here that had an issue. Operations Manager picked it up. Orchestrator saw the alert, created and started a runbook, which in this runbook it was, for this problem, was to deploy a new virtual machine and move the database server over to that new virtual machine. So Orchestrator already kicked off a deploy of a virtual machine, creates an incident inside of Service Manager for you automatically, goes through, after the VM's deployed, backs up via Data Protection Manager that virtual machine disk, or that database, and then restores it to the new SQL server, retires the original one, and then after it retires the original one, closes the incident inside of Service Manager. It can automate all these common processes that you may have when you have a problem, and because of that, gives you flexibility now in that when you get paged at 2 a.m., it's your page because the problem's already been fixed instead of having to drive in and go and fix the problem at 2 a.m. So let's show you some of this real quick. And inside of Operations Manager, I have the ability to see things like the distributed applications that I have deployed. So those expense applications that we deployed inside of VMM, they get pulled over into Operations Manager and are monitored as a distributed application inside of Operations Manager. The other thing I want to monitor, say, is my VMware environment. Well, through a management pack provided by Veeam, we have the ability to monitor my vCenter environment. So I can see things like all the VMware states and monitor how my virtual machines and my servers are running. If there are any errors, I can drill down into any one of these alerts and find out what's going on with that problem, with that server, and where that alert came from. I can go to, say, a particular ESX cluster, and I can look at the diagram of that cluster and see what this ESX cluster looks like. It's a server cluster here, has a couple of ESX servers attached to it, and these servers are down right now. So it shows me the red X, and I can see that I have a problem with it. And if I look through that server to find out what the problem is, I can see that it is the CPU. Something's wrong with the CPU on that server. So I can pull this information from ESX via the NWorks provider management pack. The last bit of piece I want to talk to you about today is, after I'm monitoring the underlying infrastructure, I now need to monitor the cloud itself and make sure that I'm getting the best utilization out of that. And what we have is the ability within VMM to dynamically rebalance the workload on the fly as the resource needs change. So picture, if you will, I have multiple virtual machines running on these 3 physical servers, and everything's going fine right now. But over time, one of those servers passes a threshold. That means that that physical server is just being overused. Well, at this point, VMM will automatically migrate those virtual machines off of that box onto the remaining systems inside that cluster. And when it does that, the load has now gone down, so everything's running fine, until later on in the day, one of those servers starts peaking again and starts affecting the utilization resources available on that new server. Well, at this point again, we can migrate virtual machines off and rebalance this workload across the system to get to that point where every server is running underneath that threshold that I've set for it. So dynamic optimization will do that for your Microsoft workloads, your VMware, or your Citrix Xen server workloads through dynamic optimization. The other thing is, and we talked about this before, was delegating the access to the clouds. And then the last thing is simplifying our application maintenance. So we talked about earlier on in the apps session about how to create these VM templates and these service templates, and allows us to push updates down to these templates. Well, what we do is this, basically. I have this template library, and from the template library, I pick one of those templates, say that expense manager application. I deploy a new virtual machine from that template, a set of virtual machines. I deploy that service from the template, and this service is made up of 7 VMs, 3 in the web tier, 3 in the app tier, and 1 in the database tier. Well, let's say I come up with an update where I either need to change the configuration information for the VM, or I have an update to the application. What I need to do now is to update it to that new version, or version 1.5, is first thing I do is I make a copy of that template, and I make whatever changes to that copy of the template that are necessary for the 1.5 version. Once I've done that and I've saved the template, I publish it. And when I publish the template, this service realizes that, hey, I'm running version 1.0. That same service has a 1.5 version. So I am basically pending service update. Realizes that it's pending service update. I can now set that service against that updated template. And we will do an orchestrated update of that service. So we talked about upgrade domains earlier, and we have 3 different virtual machines here. Instead of bringing all 3 down at the same time, we're going to bring them down one at a time so that we can update the service without losing any connectivity to that service. So we'll apply the update, and while the service is updating, we'll update one of those VMs, or however many per upgrade domain, at a time, so we've upgraded that entire service. And at this point now, we're running the 1.5 version of that application. So lastly, in the couple of minutes that I have left, the last thing I want to show you, and I'll talk to you about and then I'll show you, is that we need to have capacity reporting capabilities where I need to know how my systems are performing now, and not only how they're performing now, but I would love to be able to predict how they're going to be utilized in the future so that I can purchase servers before I run out of resources. And with VMM 2012, and its connection to Operations Manager, we have the ability now to see the different Hyper-V hosts, to search on things like the performance of the underlying physical servers, the networks, and the storage and CPUs, and determine what our utilization is now. And by taking basically the past 10 months, I can predict what the next 3 months are going to look at using SQL analysis services. So let's flip over real quick, and I'll just show you where that is inside of Operations Manager. So inside of Operations Manager, under Reporting, we have the ability to look at, and Operations Manager 2012 has a lot of different reporting reports built into it. But when I attached VMM to Operations Manager, we can see inside of VMM, we have the System Center Virtual Machine Manager reports. And inside of there, we have all these different new reports that are available to us. And the one that we'd be interested in for the forecasting is what we call host group forecasting. And if I bring that up, it's been running now for a little while, so I should be able to set some parameters as far as, let's do it not from the first day of this month, but let's do it from the previous month, first day. to today. So that's basically the past 40 some odd days. And I want to add object. And I think I just want to type in here con. And we see the 3 con BM hosts. And I also have these other ESX hosts as well. So I can add them in as well if I want to. So I have these Hyper-V hosts, ESX hosts, and I could then do an OK here, and it's going to search on all the disk space, memory, disk I/O, CPU, and I'll run the report. And at this point, it will go through and grab all the performance information over the past 50 days, and it will take that and it'll look at basically what the utilization is expected to be over the next 15 days. Now, unfortunately, I don't have like millions of VMs running on these boxes, so they're not very well utilized. So if I have anything over 10%, I'll be surprised. But let's see what happens as it's creating the report. And while it's creating the report, sub-report cannot be shown. Let's go back and let's just use the Hyper-V servers on there. See if that makes a difference. We'll just pick these 3 Hyper-V hosts, make it more simple. And I'm looking at the different resources there. Let's run it. If this doesn't come up, I'll show you. I mean, what one of them would look like is this. It would basically be a report, and I'd have multiple different sections, and each of those sections could come out as a PDF or an Excel spreadsheet. And I'm going to use a PDF here. And what we see is that it shows you for the CPU forecast over the past, say, 10 months, we have this amount of resources that were utilized. And then because of that, we'll be able to forecast out the next 3 months. So if I was running this environment right here, I'd see that I'm just below 80% right now. But I'm going to cross that threshold, and I don't ever want to have, less than 10% available. So I better think about getting more resources installed before I run out of those resources. One of the nice things about these reports are that after they're run, I can do things like export them into a specific file, save them as a web part or something like that so people can view them. I can also schedule when they're going to be run and have this run like every week, month, day, or something like that. That gives me a lot of flexibility on how I can get this data out to the right people. All right, so what we've shown you today in the past 45 minutes is how do we take and configure the underlying infrastructure components, how do we build the private cloud, monitor those infrastructure components, and maintain our private cloud so that it has the resources available to it that the applications that are running on it need. So we're able to take these physical diverse resources, create these logical standardized clouds through cloud abstraction, deploy or allow access to those resources, and be able to deploy services on there. Once those services are deployed, we're able to monitor both the underlying physical resources and the services that are deployed and ensure that the SLAs that we have for our customers are being met. So with that, I really appreciate your time for not only listening to me in this last session today, but coming today to this Best of MMS, and we hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.